Thank you. So thanks for being here this evening. I'm the creator and producer of a web video series called Digital Futures, which is backed by Telefonica, which showcases some of the real eclectic change makers that are in the tech industry. Now, I'm going to quickly talk you guys through the Startup DNA report powered by Wayra UK. It's the first piece of commissioned research in the UK, and I'm shocked it's taken this long, that does a deep dive into the actual social makeup of Britain's startup ecosystem. Now, we spoke to either the founders or C-suite execs themselves across 220 startups to get their take on diversity and much more. So let's set the context a little. When good old Google first revealed their diversity statistics in 2014, it caused quite a ripple effect across the industry, and I think a lot of you will remember that. Now, what also emerged very, very quickly was that this was a systemic issue, and not just about one company or a regional pocket, and certainly not just about the US. People started to realize very quickly that to actually move the needle on this, we really would have to rewire some of the attitudes in the tech industry. Now, I particularly love these photos. I pulled them up last night. We then saw headline after headline of surveys that showed the tech sector as largely comprised, no surprise, of white, well-educated males, or as some friendly commentator friends of mine very contentiously labeled it pale, male, and stale phenomena, which is probably a little harsh, so I won't use that phrase. Now, while this became uncomfortable for some folks, the questions that it stirred up were much needed. Was it the reality that most digital and technology companies simply didn't factor in diversity into their DNA? And for startups, for whom the focus, by virtue of being a startup, is needing to focus intensely on growth, was the importance of a really healthy ethnic and gender team makeup just being overlooked? Now, with so much debate on this stateside, Wayra UK wanted to investigate the state of diversity here in the UK, particularly in the digital and tech startup sectors and with early stage startups, and see how we fared. Now, that leads me to some background on the report itself. Now, the Startup DNA report, in the words of the author Simon Fanshawe, is designed not to answer questions, but really to raise them and stir them up. He also asked if, apart from the arguments for diversity, of fairness and social justice, is diversity worth pursuing for startups in order to boost competitive advantage? So does it just really make good business sense? Personally, I think it does. So we're looking to spark off some debate and drive some tangible action here. What we're not trying to do is rant about the lack of diversity in tech or lament it. However, we need to highlight it, because what you don't highlight, you simply can't measure. So here's how we structured this, just to give you some idea of how robust this research is. We partnered with 42 accelerators, incubators, and co-working spaces to target specifically early-stage startups. We spoke to 220 startups, as I mentioned, and close to 90% of the folks that responded were either the CEOs or founders. So you're hearing directly from the people that actually run these businesses. The survey is broken up into 5 sections, which I'll get onto in a minute, and we had responses from across the UK and Northern Ireland. So very quickly, here's some top-level information, quite a lot to digest there, on how these startups are actually put together. I think what jumped out for me was the third stat, right? So startups are 298%, that's sit up and take notice stuff, more likely to focus on commercial output versus social footprint. The heartening thing about this is actually you get to see creative sectors and education now make the top 5 business areas for these startups, which wasn't always the case. Now, 2 things you don't see on the slide, but actually that was cited very heavily at London Tech Week, is that we've now got a massive influx of venture capital funding coming into the UK. For the first quarter of 2015 alone, we saw a staggering £459 million, and that's a 66% year-on-year increase. The other one that is sort of really close to my heart is digital technology will contribute £18 billion to London's economy by the end of this year alone. So this is really critical stuff. So let's dive into the results in more detail. Now, inherent DNA was one of the sections we tackled, and by inherent DNA we mean gender, race, sexual orientation, the elements that we carry by default. Now, here are some striking findings that stood out for us. Being an immigrant myself, I moved here from Bangalore City 11 years ago. It's really good to see that the UK remains a global magnet for entrepreneurs. Now, this one's going to be great for the women in the room. Almost 1/3 of the UK startup ecosystem is made up of women, close to 30% of whom held executive level positions. Brilliant. I know that deserves a cheer, doesn't it? Now, the really great part of this is 24% of London entrepreneurs are women, which means we now rival New York City as the female entrepreneur capital of the world. That's brilliant. That's very heartening. Also, London entrepreneurs are 3 times more likely to be female than in Tel Aviv and Silicon Valley. Now, actually, I'd love to see a quick show of hands for how many of you are genuinely just a little bit surprised to hear about this representation of women, and how many saw it coming. So, how many are surprised? I'd expect quite a few. Yeah, so a reasonable amount. And I think, there's some of us that have historically viewed London as very conducive and a level playing field for women, but it's actually been quite challenging as well. I think it's also my personal hope that information like this will rally more parents and educators to convince 16-year-old girls to think about swapping home science for coding and IT. Now, another observation is that the UK is quite the millennial hub, with over 55% of startup employees being under 35. And overall, the UK startup ecosystem is more ethnically diverse than the US. So now we move on to acquired DNA, meaning behaviors and attitudes acquired through experience. So your mindset, your gender smarts, your language skills. I'll draw your attention in particular to the third and the last takeaway. Close to 70% of startup employees are clearly dealing with a customer base that's from a very different ethnic background to them. And more than half of us are professionally networking, like this evening, with folks from a different background. So I suppose the big question here is, if we are so culturally diverse and open in these respects, why isn't this being reflected enough in the composition of the tech workforce? Which is even more puzzling given what I'm about to show you next. The diversity piece. So overall, we found that in overwhelming numbers, UK startups embrace diversity. And they were really clear that diversity helps them in a number of ways. 79% of them said diversity helps them compete. 72% said it helps them find new markets, and 97% said they themselves were really open to working in diverse teams. And actually, you can see that just from the makeup of the startups here in Wayra, UK. So I suppose back to my question, is this sector simply not conducive enough or attractive enough for the demographics that seem to be marginally represented? What's going on with the demand and supply side? Because there's clearly an issue here. Now, these stats are of particular interest, but not just because I'm Indian myself. I think we need the wider startup community to really focus on this. Asians are the second largest demographic within the UK startup ecosystem, right? So far, so good, feel good stuff. And yet, when we widen this to open it up to be the Black Asian minority ethnic demographic, as a whole, that group only makes up 20% of the startup scene. So there's clearly something at play here. Now, the good news is, from a very intangible attraction angle, London came up as perceived as far more aspirational by quite a margin than Silicon Valley and New York City for that particular group. So, kind of rounding off here, a couple more observations. I think this one might irk the female entrepreneurs in the room. I know quite a few of you. Turns out that men have far greater access to finance than women. They're 86% more likely to be VC funded and 59% more likely to secure angel investment. I'm not delighted with that. However, women were 37% more likely to be self-funded than men. So it could be that we're just really persuasive with our friends and family to get them to buy into our ideas. I think the one that really jumped out for me was that there are very dramatic biases in sector participation. So no men in the survey reported being involved in the lifestyle sector, quite odd, and no women reported being part of a banking and finance startup. Now, obviously, this isn't absolute, because we all know a couple of people that are in those sectors that are male or female, but it's what we found from what we polled, and this does show quite a few alarming stereotypes in play here. Another important one was that actually the largest group of startup founders come from highly skilled neighborhoods. So over 80% of startup employees in the UK were university educated, and London continues to be a hotspot. 68% of those that participated in the survey were from this city. So to round this off, what's next? I think we propose that the tech sector needs to set about actually meeting some of these challenges. We're raising a number of questions for the startup community. Events like this go a long way in really firing up that debate. And there's undoubtedly a need for further research to focus on things like how the value that's driven by diversity in larger companies actually reads across to startups, why investment displays such a gender bias, and why certain sectors have low representation of certain groups. Now, Wayra and Astor Fanshawe want to lead a series of events to pursue this. If anyone's interested, please get in touch with Wayra. Wayra UK themselves want to introduce a diversity module and masterclasses for the startups in each cohort of their program, which I think is simply brilliant because it lays the diversity seed within startups before they scale to ensure that their DNA is growing as a diverse one. And the full Monday, Wayra and Astor Fanshawe will produce a full report in the autumn with case studies, all the data, and develop a comprehensive research program for the future. So while these initial results show that, yes, it's challenging, there's a lot to celebrate in the UK startup ecosystem. Diversity, it seems, is really helping drive the acceleration of new and emerging businesses. And we just need to focus on how we, as an ecosystem, promote the impact that it can make. Thank you.